I'm Lyndal Osborne, and I was born in Australia, but I'm now a Canadian citizen, and I've lived in Edmonton for about 40 years. For about the last 20 years, I've focused primarily on making installation work. Prior to that, I had a career teaching printmaking and drawing, so my work focused on printmaking and drawing for 35 years, and then I made a sudden switch. This exhibition actually is right at the cusp of that switch, because I've got a piece in the show called Nature of Matter. That was actually the last print that I ever did, and I did that in 1996. And for those people that want to notice, it actually introduces some installation work in the front of it, and that became, I think, really the trigger that made me try to think about how I could work purely with installation materials. Well, I suppose the first thing I noticed with the combination with Mary was that here's another person that's equally obsessed with the whole notion of collecting, categorizing, binding, putting things together in interesting ways. I suppose, in a sense, I would say, if I were to summarize it, that we are both people that like the idea of making some order from the world around us, because I notice in Mary's work, her collections are made very much from her own locale, and mine are too. Even though some of them are probably a little bit more exotic, they're trips that I made, and I was there, and I gathered them, and I saw them firsthand. So both of us are very interested in this whole idea of what kind of sense we're going to make out of these collected objects. I think in general, all of my work comes from a love of being outdoors and in the environment. Because I was raised in Australia and in very small country towns, and primarily near the beach on the east coast of Australia for most of my formative teenage years, I think I've always liked the idea of most of my free time has always been spent outside, and collecting became a passion for me. But I think in the last, say, probably about the last 15 years, I've become more interested in trying to deal with the things that affect my life, things that are issues or concerns around me. And I live on an acreage, and around the area where I live, there's a lot of new development going on. So what was once beautiful arable farmland in Alberta is being turned into these tract housing developments. And then I look further afield into rural Alberta, and I see that a lot of the small rural towns are disappearing and people are moving into the cities. I think it's a global issue, but I think what interests me is whatever issues I choose to be involved with, and they're all fairly socially conscious issues, I see that they're global issues, but I'm dealing with them myself, close up, firsthand. I think what becomes local becomes global. I was 21 years old when I first came, I was 21 years old when I first left Canada, and that was with my first husband, who was another Australian, and we travelled the world. And I did live in Canada for 3 of those years, in Powell River, in Montreal, and then in Vancouver. Then I went to Britain and Europe, and I didn't return to Australia for 6 years, but our intention had always been to see the world, then go back and live in Australia. But I felt not right when I went back to Australia. In the 70s or the late 60s, Australia was very male chauvinist, and it was very difficult to be treated seriously professionally as a woman, and I felt I should have gotten a better job. So both my husband and I decided to go to Madison, Wisconsin, and we went to graduate school. And after graduate school, I had tried again to see if I could get a job in Australia, but found out because I was in the child rearing years, I would not be eligible for full-time employment. I had to be part-time. But meantime, I'd been offered a lot of jobs in North America. And so the one in Edmonton was the most attractive at the University of Alberta. So that's why I settled there. And if you live long enough away from your home, the new place becomes your home. And I saw Paris, Texas, the movie, in about the mid-80s, and I realized my home is Canada. I don't really want to ever go back and live in Australia. Even though I love it and my family are there, Canada's my home. I think probably the thing that people question most is the fact my work is very visually, aesthetically attractive. And in a lot of the works that I've been doing in the last 15 years, and actually none of them are represented in this show, people say to me, why are you dealing with these social issues like the genetic modification of seeds, and yet you make it all look so beautiful? So my answer to that is that when there are organizations like Monsanto or any of the big agro-business companies, and they're trying to sell a lifestyle which includes genetically modified seeds or more use of pesticides or fertilizers or whatever it is they're selling, they sell it to you like the good life. So I use the same strategy in my work. I try to make it beautiful, but with a dark agenda underneath. Well, I've got to say, initially my parents were always so supportive of me. I think I was going to be an artist when I was very young. And they always encouraged me and my two sisters as well. They really wanted us to become musicians, and one of us did become a musician. But that was very formative in a sense that they allowed me to decide what I wanted to do. After art school, I think I was terribly interested in printmaking and the beauty of ink on paper, Goya, Rembrandt, some of the French Impressionists always interested me. So when I saw their work when I travelled around the world, that influenced me to become a serious artist and do a master's degree. But since then, I wouldn't say there's any one person that's it. I've felt like I've gone my own path in a sense, but I really rely on looking at the work of other artists, talking to other artists, and for me, working with other artists. I use a lot of people. I hire people to work with, and I really appreciate their input. So those people have been very important to me. They're not famous people, but they're people that have been particularly formative for me. When I made prints, I often made little maquettes, like little sculptural maquettes, and they became the inspiration for the prints. A curator came along and said, I'd like to do a show of your prints, but let's put some of those maquettes in the show. And they received a lot of attention, the maquettes. And that sort of started me to think, oh, people are treating this seriously. I'd always thought of it as a serious inspiration that developed my prints. So then I started making lots of small things, almost identical to the things that I'd made as inspiration for the prints, but they didn't hold up. So then I thought, I'll make some more. I'll make some more. And pretty soon I had a repetition of similar but not the same objects. And then I had to face the problem of how do you display these? What sort of format can you come up with? And that's where I started to seriously get involved with installation, which for me allowed me to do more research and thinking about the ideas that were behind the work, introducing new elements like sound, introducing the idea of hanging rather than always using the wall, things coming up from the floor, dramatically lighting work in a way that invited the viewers to enter the space and move around the space and become totally involved and engaged in the work. And once I discovered that, I could never go back to two-dimensional work.